All right, let's get some analysis now. Political economist Biniza joins us via Skype. So, Sia, the Small Business Rescue Plan, what do you make of it?
Sure. Look, I think it's definitely a very noble effort, and I think it's very needed given the current climate. But I'm actually more concerned about the more difficult thing of how do we ensure that the funding provided available to people is actually geared towards holding jobs and paying salaries, as opposed to obviously, paying for other fixed costs that small businesses face. And obviously, there's still the major concern around the informal sector, who perhaps may not be well catered for in terms of these sort of major government funds that are geared more towards the medium and bigger type of enterprises that are largely formalized.
So 3 billion rand has also been set aside for industrial funding. I mean, this is money that government obviously is trying to ease the burden and blow when it comes to businesses. But is that really going to have a big impact?
Well, it will also depend on how government actually deploys this sort of industrial funding. Typically, what government does is they will require or they'll provide funding ex post. So if the industrial policy incentives are anything to go by, it'll be a challenge for government to then say after companies have survived, obviously, the COVID season and they've had to incur a number of expenditures to then say, please come and account for the expenditures and then we'll provide the funding sort of ex post. If the funding is geared sort of upfront and with certain conditionalities in order to maintain jobs, I think that's really the major risk, apart from the actual loss in demand that businesses face, is how do you ensure that that funding is geared towards saving jobs and paying salaries, which is the actual more difficult thing. So it'll all depend on how the actual funding is implemented. And if it's ex post, I don't think that it'll have much of a positive impact because it'll come after a lot of firms have already run out of business or have already shut down.
So let's talk about the bigger picture and the impact of a slowing business sector. What's that going to do to our growth rate? What's that going to do to our economy in the next 6 months?
Sure, and you'll remember that as of the end of last year, we had gotten into a technical recession, and already when the data came out earlier this year, I was expecting us to be in at least another 3 months of slow growth. And this was obviously before the impact of the coronavirus now as we've seen it. So I expect perhaps South Africa and the global economy obviously being the bigger driver on this one to remain in recession perhaps for another 3 quarters this year, if not for most of the year. And my bigger concern is obviously that there's a lot of focus on how to manage the macroeconomy in terms of even the Reserve Bank coming in, lowering rates, etc. But I don't see a lot of emphasis in terms of ramping up, in terms of the testing, public healthcare systems being beefed up in order to deal not just with the prioritized COVID patients, but also with non-COVID patients who need medical attention. If anything is to go by looking at the experience of places like Italy, etc., we should be putting out calls at this point to call on retired medical professionals, etc., in order to ensure that the medical healthcare system in South Africa is able to deal with the influx of people and also ramp up the testing, which is much more important in order to deal with the pandemic, in as much as the funds for businesses as well as the macroeconomic interventions are important. We also need to keep our eye on the actual public health response, which is the only way we're going to actually deal with the pandemic.
All right, thanks for the insights. Appreciate it. Political economist Biniza.